Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Angus.
Good to see you. It's been quite a while with the Easter break and yeah, lots of things going on in life. But we finally got around to looking at this final chapter.
Indeed, yes. A lot of viewers have passed under the bridge for their last couple of videos.
Yes, it's been an interesting development, hasn't it? The last two videos, something popped, as you say.
Yes.
But something's popped in the YouTube sphere. So we'll see what happens with this one. This chapter, like all chapters, this is a fascinating book, but this chapter is so topical. From my perspective, I'm going to try and unpack it a little bit, but I mean, Augustine. I don't know why I'm saying Augustine, because it's Augustine. We're talking about a guy who lived like more than 1500 years ago, and the point that one of the central points that I'm going to be making is this is the modern man. It sounds a contradiction to say it, so like somebody who lived 1500 years ago, but the way Steiner depicts him in this, so the relationship that we've got to philosophy, the relationship to what is a spiritual path, I think there's a lot of stuff that we can unpick here to sort of like make this seemingly ridiculous statement actually really quite plausible in the terms of, it's like when we're talking about, it's like spiritual growth. So where am I going to start? Let's actually start with some little bits from the text itself. I mean, already in the second paragraph, Steiner talks about how he suffered deeply from the most appalling doubts, such as attack one who has felt the impotence of thoughts in the face of spiritual problems, and who has tasted the depressing effect of the question, can man know anything whatsoever? I mean, that's already Hume, isn't it? That's skepticism right there. And Descartes is also the issue of doubt creeping in strongly there. What can we even know about the world? And after that paragraph, Steiner tells us, informs us that, I should say, so reminds us, using Augustine's own words, that Augustine recognized that his problem was that he could only picture the spiritual to himself in material images. And he quotes Augustine, who says, "When I wished to think of God here, I could only imagine quantities of matter and believe that was the only kind of thing that could exist. This was the chief and almost the only cause of error which I could not avoid." And in that sense, we could be talking a little bit about the naive realism we've encountered in the philosophy of freedom. So like only what I can see is real, and for a naive realist, thoughts aren't real. They're just inventions. They're subjective sort of like fantasies that have nothing to do with reality. So this, in this sense, so like there's this very strong hint of the modern man, his spiritual dilemma. It's like I can only think about the material because that's where I get all the information from perception, and I unconsciously mix my thinking in there, but I never actually attribute any reality, any agency to thinking itself. So this is the curse of it's like metaphysical realism, that if we are going to, we have to invent metaphysical realism if we don't accept that thoughts are real. As soon as we accept them real, then we can return to the monism that's like described amply in the philosophy of freedom.
Can you
So,
unpack
go on.
that? Can you unpack that a little bit? Not for me necessarily.
Yeah, sure.
But for folks that might be listening, what is metaphysical realism? I think naive realism explained itself as you spoke of it. But what do you mean when you say metaphysical realism?
So the metaphysical realism, it recognizes that there is something to perception. It recognizes that there is something to thinking, but it can't actually attribute any reality to thinking itself. So it has to create let's call them like fantasy pictures. Kant's like famous Ding an sich, the thing in itself, something beyond perception to reference something that is real. So the key problem for, I'll go back, I'll revisit naive realism again, and perhaps hopefully it'll become clearer. A naive realist thinks that everything you can perceive is real. But then it comes across this problem that let's say it's like this well-known example that Steiner mentions in Theosophy, for example. So like if I go out into a field and I see a flower in the field, let's say it's a tulip, uncommon flower to have in a field, but I'm going to use a tulip. There's a tulip in the field, and so like I see that, I perceive it. And it produces, it's like a reaction in my being, and I can create a memory of that picture. But that, just like my memory picture can fade, that tulip will fade. That is, it'll dissolve into, so as winter comes along, it's like it'll disappear. So the percept, what the naive realist thinks is true reality, that fades. There's nothing permanent about it. But if we return back to the same place, like next year, another tulip appears. So there's clearly something living there which is like beyond the senses, which causes it to reappear. But instead of attributing permanence to like what is recreating that, it's the naive realist will only attribute reality to what can be perceived. But the perceivable everything like disappears in time, except the spirit doesn't. It's like keeps coming back. So naive realist denies the reality of thinking. It's not, it's just our invention. The metaphysical realist recognizes that this is a difficult circle to square here, but rather than recognizing the reality of spirit, which is recognized through thinking, it's like in our conceptual life, it creates something beyond perception, which isn't thinking, because it can't make that mistake of saying thinking is real, and then gets trapped in its own. It's created this. It's like this third world to which it has no access, but still says that that is the source of everything. That is the source of reality.
So to clarify, an example to clarify might be a model, a theoretical model that is supposed to be somewhat accurately real, because clearly if we can't see the inner workings of something, they must be similar to the outer workings, but projected onto in a metaphysical way, projected into a model that eventually, if we have the right instrumentation, we'll be able to discover exactly how the mechanics of it work, right? That sort of thing. So that's metaphysical realism.
Great.
As it's practiced in science, as it's practiced in religion, it is a god with a a beard and then lives in the sky and is sort of human-like, and that sort of, it's a projection of our personal experiences into a metaphysical realm, and so therefore both of them are a fixed dualism. The metaphysical realists amongst us don't think of themselves as dualists because they forget that they're modeling, that they're believing their metaphors and their models as the reality. So that's a good revisit. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good, nice that you add that layer of clarification on there, and especially with the image that you're using there of, it's like God. It's like in a childlike conception of God, it's sort of like some being, so like that we cannot see, that's in the sky, sort of like affecting everything, which is, to use your exact words, it's a metaphysical realism. It's saying we cannot know it, but we have to assume it, that it's there. From a religious perspective, yeah,
it's like a worldview version of projection, psychological projection.
Yeah. So, so the modern man, Augustine, the modern man's like stuck in only able to conceive, to be real, what can be seen with the senses, and he has this to many people well-known phrase, which I think is beautifully poetic, where he says, this is from the Confessions, I believe it was, where he said he's recognized the desperation that he's living in with the doubts and that he has in his mind. So he says, I asked the earth, Augustine is asking, where can I find the divine? And he says, I asked the earth, and she said, I am not it. And all that was upon the earth said the same. I asked the ocean and the abysses and all that lives in them, which said, we are not thy God. Seek beyond us. I asked the winds and the whole atmosphere, and its inhabitants said, the philosophers who sought for the essence of things in us were under an illusion. We are not God. I asked the sun, moon, and stars, which said, we are not God whom thou seekest. And then Augustine wakes up and says, there is only one thing which can answer his question about the divine, his own soul. This idea that it's like we've got to go inwards to make contact with the divine. You can hear the life living in his desperation to find it, but also like that, it's like a form of deliverance. That's like he suddenly recognizes, okay, I'm not going to find God by like continually interrogating nature. I've got to find it somewhere else, and you and I would probably add on, and then you will rediscover it outside in nature, but it has to be found within first.
Yeah, but he didn't make that last move.
That's the part of it. In that sense, he is also truly a modern man.
Well, yeah, well, he's a modern man in the sense also of being extraordinarily impressionable, right? It's like he was always looking for something exogenous in his world, other people's thinking, trains of thought of the day. He went from, one sort of life of excess to a kind of Manichaeism, to a Neoplatonism, he was understandably trying on a lot of different philosophical and spiritual suits of clothes. But I also think it's really important that he was sort of like a prism. He was sort of like a prism for his time, and for a time that would be dawning as our time. The part of that bit that you were reading basically is Descartes, the part that says, I think, therefore I am. I mean, I know I exist by virtue of me as a thinking being.
Yeah.
He's basically saying, I I doubt, therefore I am. I know I doubt that I have a soul, therefore there is a soul, and I exist. And that's a powerful statement, and it speaks to the way in which he's merely a medium for that which is being the currencies of the day, the thought currencies of the day. And so, in doing a little research about him, if you look into Steiner's incredible work of lectures, collection of lectures called the Redemption of Thinking, which is a project to unearth scholasticism as a whole, as a monistic spiritual philosophy, say, the true monism, which got Steiner in trouble with the Gerardo Bruno Society of his time, because they thought he was trying to bring the Catholic Church into the scientific union. But where was I going there? The
Augustine redemption of thinking.
Redemption of thinking. Yes, his reliance on, in the end, on the church and the church forefathers, the oral and written traditions as fixed in time. In a way, things he did because he was not the master of his own domain, that have a legacy that really is has created a merely historical relationship with the Christ, because in order to because you can't find the divine in nature, you can't relate, your soul can't relate to the natural world in a way that sees the spiritually manifest within it, saves the appearances through coming to see what's esoteric in the natural world. Because he couldn't do that, he falls back on the linkage between the mysteries. He falls down, I should say, at the point where the mysteries are linked, particularly by Origen in I believe that's how you pronounce his name. That held the idea, for example, of the transmigration of souls, that understood that we're pre-existent, and that very Eastern idea of origin, interestingly enough, as Genesis, ongoing Genesis, is ontogenesis, we might say today, that he was in the what date was the first council? The second council was in the 500s, right? Where Origen himself was deemed a heretic, right? And so this is Augustine, impressionable to the church forefathers and their decision making that happened, that was sanctioning the official church as this historical relationship to the Christ event, as opposed to an infused understanding of the Christ living in the moment all the time, something like that. Bail me out here. I think I'm doing pretty good job, but I'm all over the place.
No, yeah, I want to. In my mind, I'm a little bit unsure because you've mentioned it, but I've actually got Augustine's like prior to Origin, but you might have like a clearer read on that. I think he is, but so the flavor of what you're saying, I think is really important to unpack. And the way Steiner does it in this particular chapter is interesting, because he says that it's like, I want to preface what I'm about to say from the book with other ideas that you can read elsewhere in Steiner about, and that we've also actually met in this book. This idea that in prior to Augustine, it's like basically the word heresy, I'm not going to say it didn't exist, but it wasn't as problematic. Heresy, the word itself comes from I choose. But there was a much more, one of the impressions that we've got from reading this book and other material is Christianity didn't have this like dogmatic aspect. There was something real happening in the world, and there was like a multitude of ways of sort of like accessing this spiritual event that had happened, and that was like resounding in so many souls. And someone like Augustine, so you didn't have, so the Catholic Church in that sense, like it was beginning to form itself, it's like create an identity, but it wasn't fully formed, and people were very happy sort of like picking what would later become called like different heresies as they tried to approach this great mystery. And as another aside, just before I like launch into the book itself, I think heresies themselves are very interesting ways of understanding the complexities of, it's like what we're talking about here. So how did these heresies come about? It's like Pelagianism, so like, which became a heresy. The problem with that is there's like the free will aspect, but it being sort of like taken, extended to include realms that it shouldn't. And perhaps I shouldn't have introduced that here because it will take a lot of unpacking. But ultimately, the Catholic Church recognized that there was a problem with it. It's like with calling Pelagianism a heresy, and they actually they made a conciliatory step and like said that semi-Pelagianism was okay. So half Pelagianism isn't a heresy, but full Pelagianism is. Anyway, so sorry about that little deviation there. But in the book, in the final chapter here of this book, Steiner points out that Augustine recognized that there were. Augustine didn't recognize it. This is the way Steiner describes it. Augustine was like, he had reached that recognition that he's got to delve inside to find the divine. And there are two ways of doing this. Steiner says one would be like the old, the way from the mystery schools, which is a strengthening of the human soul, a strengthening of the inner forces, which will lead the soul to knowledge of its true self, and then Christ reveals itself within that process. But Augustine didn't take that path. He took the other path, which became the model for the Catholic Church, which was just believing, well, I'll quote what he actually says here. It consists in ceasing to develop one's own soul forces at a certain point, and in borrowing conceptions connected with the coming of Christ from written accounts and oral traditions. This key aspect of just being enough with faith. This is where also this is part of my explanation why I think it's also fully valid to talk about Augustine as a modern man, in the sense that a believer says that it is just enough to believe. Augustine is their role model, because that's what he was advocating, that you should believe the traditions. And that was enough. The soul strengthening that was a prerequisite of the mystery schools was the other path that was open to him, but which he chose not to take.
Yes, maybe there's more than one origin, but the origin I'm thinking of is around 1 to 200.
Oh yeah, okay, right.
And that idea of the mystery schools lived through him. He experienced the idea of free will, for example, as well. And I imagine that that's part of the heresy, the Justinian declaration of heresy.
Mm-hmm.
So having said that, you have somebody who is an existentialist in the modern sense, Augustine, right? But not quite an existentialist, say somebody who's experiencing the angst, looking for comfort of soul, seeking solace in the Christ as represented by the documents and doctrine of the church,
Mm-hmm.
and deciding that the human soul could not be infused with the spirit so directly as we recognize it as thinking, which is a wonderful way to compare, right? Because that's what that's what we are saying. That's what the outline of esoteric science is saying. This is Steiner alludes to this in this chapter, that there's another path, and he's saying this, the church went down this very significant but ultimately limiting historical path that at a certain point in the soul's development would what does Augustine say, that the head on the proud neck of or the proud head on the neck of, right, something like that.
I wanted to bring that
there
in.
would not be enough
to clarify.
Yeah, in a minute. There would not be enough humility if you try to develop your soul, right? And I find that just to be ridiculous, frankly, because the deeper I become spiritually, the deeper I become intimate with the that which is being in reality, that which is a multiplicity of being, through my own individual development, it's very, very humbling, right? Because I am the eye of the needle, right? I'm just this slight distillation of all that exists, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean slight in the sense of self-deprecation. I mean that it's my responsibility to move with that slightness, with a trust as faith in thinking, as it infuses my soul, right, in relationship to the sensual world and in relationship to the meditative and contemplative spiritual experience of the world. And you can see that what Augustine ends up doing and doesn't mean to do is sort of psychologically projects his own duality, his own feeling of limitation of what thinking can do in relationship to nature, to the natural world, and then just sort of merely personally powerfully writes a doctrine that then Thomas of Aquinas picks up and concretizes as faith as belief, as accepted belief, as a sort of leap of faith kind of thing, as blind faith, as opposed to the faith that we've been trying to engage with, which is a trust in a spiritual process that we are part of and can freely wield if we choose to do so, something like that. And this is a very, very frustrating thing for me. You can tell, like because I identify with him, and he is so thoroughly modern in this sense.
Yeah.
But he takes it. It's hard for modern thinkers to see this because it's on the religious side as opposed to the scientific side. But you see how they're the same, right? How the materialism within the church is mirrored by the materialism that grew out of it as the natural scientific view.
Yeah. I'm going to sort of read that bit that you're talking about, the humility there, because I think it's a really interesting part to unpack. Because Steiner says here, Augustine rejected the first way as springing from pride of soul. He thought that the second way was the way of true humility. And there's part of me that says, if you recognize that you are weak, if you are weak morally, then you have to, I mean, this is knowledge of higher worlds 101, isn't it? You've got to work with yourself morally, because if you try to go this like deepening path yourself, then you are opening yourself up to dangers. So in a sense, I fully resonate with what he's saying there. He's talking about realities as I see them, and in that sense, I also see modern people. I mean, people start living today. In the sense that they shy away from deepening themselves into this spiritual path, if it is because like morally they don't feel they are where they need to be, then that is also like an understandable reason to hold back. But that's only half of the equation. Because the other half is that's what you've got to battle through, because ultimately faith is, it's the first step. It's the start of a journey. It's not, the way I understand it, it's not the end of the journey. And if people think that faith is going to take them all the way there, as Augustine thought, that's where the problems really start. I guess you would understand that in the same way.
Yeah, I would say faith is like the founding rhythm, and it's the intuitive relationship with reality that we grow in. As our souls develop, we grow in relationship to, or that intuition itself starts to extend into a more clear and conscious faith, right? It's in the reality that we perceive ourselves participating in, and the more we're participating in the bringing about of that reality, the more that intuition becomes intuition. I wouldn't say devoid of faith, but the faith sort of grows. It sort of meld. Intuition
becomes experiential, doesn't it?
Becomes participatory, experiential. Yeah. Yes, and you get this. I don't want to criticize Augustine yes, it's you. He's like a '90s rock star, it's like,
you thinking of anyone in particular?
He's full of angst, right? Yeah, I think of early Pearl Jam or to some extent Nirvana, and these folks who are like, their emotional angst was merely personal, and it would have been better if they wrote that shit down in a diary than institutionalize it in a church. You know what I mean? And sort of the grunge movement was a sort of emo church. I like a lot of that music, and I like the way it evolved, in the way that some of the people involved. Although Eddie Vedder is an ass as it relates to COVID and other things. His purchase of modern day ideologies are probably what happened to Augustine during the pandementia, as you mentioned, because he was so damn impressionable. It's frustrating. It's frustrating because then that's what people think Christianity is. They think it's this church that is blind faith oriented, and like my mom, she never believed that she could engage with the spiritual realities and beings in a growingly intimate way. And what the hell's the point, right? Right. And some people say that, what the hell's the point? So let's believe in the metaphysical realism of science instead, right? And so it is frustrating, and you can see the way in which this dualistic, what do you say? This default dualism that Augustine adopts, because his soul can't know the world. His soul can't really be the thinking entity. It has to accept some transcendent God or some prophets and forefathers who who were more proximal to the spiritual reality of a historical moment. And we're left with this default dualism that the church has taken on, right? And everybody thinks that's what Christianity is. Now, if we want to talk about what esoteric Christianity is, there it is, right there, right? It's like if we would have, if Origen hadn't been deemed a heretic, and that stream would have been allowed to flow, it wouldn't have been. It wouldn't be currently heretical to the Catholic Church for you and I to be talking like this, right?
Yeah. That image that you created of Augustine as grunge rock, that's going to stay with me for a while. I think one of the things that's interesting, and this also refers to another part a little bit earlier in the chapter, is the interesting thing about why didn't Augustine choose Paul as his model for understanding what Christ, because Christ is one of the ways in which Paul is exceptional is he was the first to see the risen Christ. He never saw the Christ in the flesh. He only ever saw the risen Christ, and that was direct and experiential. So there was like a model out there for him to access, but clearly Augustine to like recognize that wasn't the path for him, and wouldn't be the path for a lot of humanity until perhaps like the 20th century. But there is an interesting thing that this being hard on Augustine, because there is something that Steiner adds into the mix here, which makes him like an even more interesting character, because he talks about this. He mentions, I'll read the quote and then unpack it a little bit. Augustine said, "What is now called the Christian religion already existed among the ancient and was not lacking at the very beginning of the human race. When Christ appeared in the flesh, the true religion already in existence received the name Christian." And this was written in it's like his book called Retractions, which is basically he went back and he revisited like all the things that he had written and said in the past. So right at the end of his life, there's this sentiment, or there's this notion that he might well have sort of like there's still room for growth, and I find this image that Augustine paints is also like critical, because it really is also a way of summarizing what we've been saying about the mystery schools throughout this whole process, that the purpose of these mystery schools was to come into contact with the Logos, that which already existed. And there's even another there's a very tight link to Paul here, because in the Acts, I'm just going to read this from the Acts from Paul, which confirms, because there are some interpreters of Augustine who say no, he didn't mean that, and they'll give equivocating messages as to why he didn't mean what we are understanding when we discuss it here. But in Acts 17:23, St. Paul, in his mission to the Greeks, famously instructed the Athenians, "For as I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship, I even found an altar with the inscription, 'To the unknown God. Therefore, the one whom you worship without knowing him, I proclaim to you.'" And this is this idea that Augustine, that I think Augustine might be picking up on, that there's a recognition of that the Logos always being accessible, which is what Christ represented, but it was to an elect group of people, what we might call today is like an elite, and that actually Christ coming in the flesh was a way of opening up these mysteries so that the mystery process became accessible to every single human being.
That's super key. That last bit, that's super key. And it helps me a little bit not be such a hater on old
on grunge rock.
in part, it does. So let's unpack this a little bit, because there's the mystery schools, and the mystery schools were for a select few, and their souls had to be ready for it. It wasn't because it was an elitist project or something like bullshit like that. It was because it would break you if you tried to cross the threshold without readiness and without guidance. Right? We see the 1960s were an example of people being broken permanently by exogenous, unguided trips to the threshold and never coming back to some extent. So, ironically, Augustine's description of nature as not where you would find God was projecting his own limitations on our relationship with nature. Even though all you said is true, he saw that the Logos existed as the Christian reality before the event at Golgotha, or the baptism, say. He's basically doing two things and self-contradictory. This is a problem with dualism, default or otherwise. Is he's trashing Heraclitus, right? He's basically saying, Heraclitus is saying, the spiritual is alive as processes in the mothers, right? And for Heraclitus, it was fire. For Pythagoras, it was all three. For Heraclitus, it was all three. And it was all three not as a theoretical projection or model or a dualistic thing, but they were experiencing spiritual processes in elemental reality, right? And they were calling it the mother because it's the genesis that's going on all around us, this creation. And it's not, like, if you use that word, it's hijacked into the church that Augustine gave us. But creation is creation, and it's going all the time. We're always participating in it. And we're not going to overcome modernity with a meta-modernity or a meta-modern spirituality until we overcome dualism, not as theoretical monism, but as an actual monistic act that is experienced and participated in. So I understand also, and this is the other key part, that apparently I'm Augustinian, I'm sort of Augustinian person myself, because I've got these conflicting, to ultra modern self-conflicting statements, but I understand with what you were saying better now, the necessity of an Augustine as a symptom. Because he was so impressionable. He wasn't an agent of his own making, in the sense of a truly postmodern personage, which we are on the threshold of giving birth to if we don't destroy ourselves first. And this is why people are turning to Christianity now. And I'm saying this conversation we're having, here's an offering for the lineage of Christianity as it could have been, and still can be. And it's not in a church. It's not in an institution. It's not in the historical fathers. They can be inspirations, right? There can be a conversation, just like any good like any good person who's interested in thinkers goes to the source of the best ones in the field in which they think, and starts to become conversant with them, dialogues with them. When you can say Nietzsche would have said this, then you understood Nietzsche, right? If you can, you're having dialogue essentially with the spirit of Nietzsche. So I that helps me. Your description helps me to realize that part of what we're talking about is the evolution of consciousness, and it, in a sense, had to go in that direction. It's still hard to take, because I don't believe we would have had the Crusades if we would have followed the Origen's doctrine, so-called doctrine, rather than the Augustine Aquinas doctrine. And I'm fully aware that I'm criticizing Rudolf Steiner here if he were indeed the reincarnation of Thomas Aquinas, right? But I think he's doing some things to fix that problem here.
I think so. He would argue that this was how can I put this? This process that humanity had to go through was ultimately for its own benefit. Because if we became spiritual again, or if let's go to 1250. What does 1250 represent in anthroposophy? It's like the time supposedly when the doors to the heavens completely shut. We were like completely on our own. It's like being chucked out of your parents' house, like right, you're on your own. But as so this seems like one way of understanding this is a cruel destiny. It's like God sort of like says, you're on your own. But the possible fruit of that for a soul is a recognition of the need to strengthen its own forces so that it can like reascend. We're quite used to this idea. It's like where it's like we're at an inflection point down here. It's like we've been continually like coming down into matter. It's like as human beings, but at humanity, so like it's over the coming like couple of thousand years, it's at this stage where it can. We're possibly at a nadir where people can consciously choose to like still live on planet Earth, but with like direct spiritual experience, which they use to regenerate, to recreate societies on Earth, societies that we want to live in. Or alternatively, people can like be stuck in the materialism, and then they actually they continue descending into the material realm to become what Steiner describes as subhumans. And this strengthening of soul that was that became possible by being cut off from your parents. So Augustine, I could see, perhaps we've talked as like in previous conversations, especially in reference to Philo, how understanding the Bible as like as stages of the soul towards meeting Christ. But I think we can also begin to see Augustine also as a staging post. You know, seeing his life as an example of a stage which we all have to pass through. This doubting about the reality of the spiritual world, being an atheist for a while, it grounds you in a different way. And so if you are going to escape out of it, you have to have if you're going to escape out of it, you're going to need a mixture of grace, and you're going to need this like a taking of yourself seriously, the suffering that you are feeling, the doubt that Augustine is feeling, your dissatisfaction with life. They become like forces within you that make you look for something that's capable of alleviating that pain. And this is something that Steiner also talks about multiple times. It's like it's at these deepest moments of suffering that Christ can make his appearance to us. So suffering, when we are suffering, when we are helpless, that is actually when we open ourselves up so that something can come in, something stronger can grow inside ourselves. But we've got to recognize our own weak our own weakness. Is that a picture you recognize, or have you seen? I definitely, I'm not talking personally here, but is that also, because you've read as much Steiner as I have? Is that how you sort of like see his description, or would you like to add any details?
I think that I think you're not wrong. I don't think it's wrong. I think it's correct. Uh, uh, you have an appreciation of the suffering bit in a different way than I do. I mean, I agree with that. Like I in my experience in life is that you find the Holy Spirit alive in you when you fall back, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the faith as knowledge. Right? It's an intuition, and it's there. It's just existentially there. I didn't know that when I was 20 years old, right? I was desperately, in trouble because I didn't know that, right? And it wasn't part of my institutional life to have. But in fact, it was the idea that there would be a self that could be connected with the divine was. I mean, it seems ridiculous to say it, right? That to a certain mindset that is so obvious that I don't even have to go into that. So, and yes, suffering is like any sense organ. Intuition is a sense organ, as I would say. But it's a concept. It's a cognitive sense organ. It's a thinking sense organ. It's sense. It's the union of sense and perception, or sense and thinking, perception and thinking, knowing and perceiving. Even though, so like any sense organ, as I was going to say, like the eyes, for example, I imagined that there was a certain point when it was rather painful to have these apertures, these openings, tear through a membrane and open up as part of our brain is exuded into the, thanks to the exusi, our eyes exude from our brain. And that probably was a rather painful process. I think of William Hurt in Altered States, going through, recapitulating a sort of evolutionary process and the painfulness that morphology would take on in certain moments. Childhood illnesses are an example of the way in which children grow into their bodies, if they're not medicated out of that process. So I get that part of it, but I think the humility part is a kind of suffering of your own. I wouldn't say weakness. That vulnerability is a strength, and I think this is what Nietzsche meant when he said evil springs from weakness, and weakness isn't. Weakness is the need to control things. Right, the objectification of nature makes you weak in relationship to reality, say, and so I don't necessarily agree that the Crusades were necessary, right? Like, I don't think that kind of suffering needed to happen. I don't think World War I needed to happen. I don't think World War II needed to happen. I think that there's freedom in this process, and that we're defaulting to our own comfort or rationalizations if we don't take up our own agency within these thresholdian realities, say, and not depend on again, Augustine is a thoroughly modern person, and that he depends on everything external to define his world for him. Right, external doctrine, external thought, the thought of the time, the absolute mystery that is nature turned into well, let's say not a mystery anymore, but just something that's not knowable, this results in a kind of thinking that results in a kind of Kantianism, right? And you mentioned Hume and Kant, and so there's a real effects in the world because the church decided to go in the direction it went, for, I would say, mixed motives, to say the least. Like that it was trying to control a population certainly was part of its motivated reasoning. You know, the power and control was certainly part of the way it institutionalized itself as a governing force, right? So I'm not so easy with that that kind of suffering that we visit upon ourselves because of and I think now we're and I've said this before, that because of this duality, this default duality, we're at war with ourselves, and that's not necessary. Like, but it's also an opportunity. So I see both things. Yeah.
Once you brought in the exousiai there, which actually brings us to another slight key point in this chapter, because he talks about the relationship between Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, and he points out like the importance of John Scotus Erigena, Charles the Bald, and this link to De Divisione Naturae, and the doctrine of Dionysus of the Areopagite. And why is this like so important? Well, the book that we're reading together in Matt's group is Esoteric Science, and we are just as we launch into Saturn, the whole hierarchy that is the basis for it's like the whole Aquinian, it's like strict scholastic stream of thinking, is there in Steiner as well, but ultimately it's like if you've got the hierarchies, and then above the hierarchies you've got the Trinity, you've got the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit in there. It's like as central to that model. And this is by just staying with at the step of faith, rather than a deepening of the soul, what every human being who decides to either not engage it at all or to just stay at the faith level, what they are doing is my understanding, of course, and this is how I understand it, is they are precluding the possibility of directly experiencing how the different hierarchies are real and around us today. And this is in Esoteric Sciences, we'll be unpacking like in the weeks to come in Matt's group, that these events in the far past, they are spiritual in origin, and once you understand, it's like the spirit that is guiding, you are able to trace. It's like back, for example, you were talking about the senses and the relationship between, I think if I remember correctly, it was the angels and the seraphim, that it is like by an interaction of them that actually it's like the senses became a possibility. The seeds first for our senses were sown in the Saturn. I know we're getting a long way from Christianity as mystical fact, but what I'm trying to emphasize here is the centrality of Dionysus Areopagite, and it's that this notion of hierarchies, and that a conscious working with the soul means as like a gradual awakening to an experience of how these are real. These aren't just metaphysical inventions. These are beings with agency, and those beings with agency are the creator of the world. And that at the top of this hierarchy beyond there is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and it is through Christ that we are actually able to slowly wake up to the reality of that agency.
Yeah, you can, and you can trace this because not long after, a few hundred years after Augustine, the lineage that he participated in got rid of the Trinity inside the church, right? And so then the hierarchy became an inversion of the spiritual hierarchy, right? And it became not a good inversion either. Like it became like a devolutionary inversion or something like that, or a refracted, an amputation.
Can you describe? I'll unpack that a little bit. I'm not exactly sure yet. What
in the Marshall McLuhan sense, the instead of the medium being a through line, we believe the appearances of the thing. So we have like you have the spiritual hierarchy, which has to do with a continuity of multiplicity of a trinity, recapitulated in right, over and over and over, everywhere we look, right, everywhere we are, we're there's the world manifests in trinities, and so there's the original archetypal trinity and yada yada, right? That's the spiritual reality, yada yada. So here's what I'm trying to do. Of course, everything that we do, if we're cut off from the spiritual hierarchies, is going to recapitulate the reality, but without the through line, right? And so what we ended up is with, when we eliminated the Trinity, is we the third being us as spiritual entities within physical and soul bodies, etheric physical and soul bodies. We eliminate the through line, which is us, the spiritual connectivity, intuition, faith, and then everything is just this sort of mechanistic reproduction. So what does the hierarchy look like? It looks like people in charge, right? It looks like whoever could grab the authority wins, right? Because the hierarchy is the reality, right? And this predates natural science and the idiocy of the survival of the fittest that was actually applied in the 18th and 19th century, right? I mean, this was ingressing into humanity. It was becoming creeping concretism of a collapsed point of view that was bereft completely of the spirit. Now, this all sounds like lament, and to some degree, I guess it is, but what I really want to do is celebrate that that the actual Christianity hasn't even been tried yet. You know, there's some mystics along the way. The Knights Templar got chased around and burned, and there are people who tried it, but it never became somewhat institutionalized, say, and this is we're living in a time when this is the opportunity. And see, this seems pretty clear to me. There is of course, the technologies that we create today are going to be amputations of real evolutionary faculties, both as they've evolved, but also as their potential. And that's McLuhan. What McLuhan brought is that gift. And as did Barfield from a different, more internal and more complete perspective with his study in idolatry, saving the appearance as a study in idolatry, where the through line is recaptured, I think, in a way that McLuhan doesn't. But it really inspires this picture that we need people in charge because we're cut off from the actual source of which we are part of. That authors, organizations, authors, institutions, authors are the way in which we sociologically configure ourselves. All of that.
You've helped me. I'd like to bring back to the point you made about crusades now, because I think I understand more clearly what it is that you're objecting to, as like in the crusades, and why I do think it was necessary But now that I understand your McLuhan angle a little bit better, I'm not saying you have to agree with me, but so I'm going to unpack the idea that it's like, let's look at the end of the Second World War, and it's like the destruction that being like wreaked upon humanity. And so I'm going to go back even further. I'm going to go back to the end of the First World War. So First World War, destruction. So what do? League of Nations. Within 30 years, within 20 years actually, it's redundant because the powers that shouldn't be have infiltrated it. So these dark powers, these institutions have become so corrupt that they're not capable of doing the job. The United Nations was a follow-on. It was League of Nations Part 2. And in actually, if you look at it just like purely from a quantitative perspective, it did a better job because it held humanity in a better place for longer than 20 years. But ultimately, we see how it's like there are problems. There are multiple problems there, and especially if you look at WHO and NATO and all of these others like global or semi-global organizations, we see how they ultimately become the targets of parasites, those that want to wield power rather than do good, and to be the good gardener, or to be the shepherd. And this is why, unfortunately, I do think this is part of my thinking about why destruction is necessary, because every time we fuck up, seriously, we have to destroy ourselves so we can have another go at doing a better job. This isn't in any way supposed to be a defense of World War I, World War II, Crusades. This is a recognition of human nature and the way in which power attracts the type of forces that shouldn't be in power. So those forces have to be dissolved. I remember, still linked with the same theme. I always found it curious, for example, that the Greeks, that they held Mars in such high regard, the god of war, or why Shiva, it's like the destructor, is such a key part of the Indian pantheon. It's because destruction is part of the growth process, or as Goethe says, it's like nature invented death so that she could have more life. That's a little bit my perspective on it. I don't know if it clarifies, or you'd like to add something there.
A great perspective. I love the way this conversation has evolved. You know, part of the reason that the United Nations worked was for the time that it worked was because we were just about to destroy ourselves with nuclear technology, right? So it was like, we better globalize our economy, right? Because and the motivations were economic. I mean, let's like I won't have my stuff if we destroy each other, kind of, almost. That was that part of it. But there's also real existential terror at that which we unleashed, which is essentially spiritual in nature, half understood, or not even a half, fractionally understood, as something that could be utilized. We never lost the utility mentality. We just tried to be, good stewards of it, right? But without a spiritual picture, one-sided destruction is threatening us now because of the globalization, the globalizing of supply chains, the planetization of the Earth into an Anthropocenic reality. Like, this is now we're living in the Anthropocene, right? I believe this. I believe this. The civilization risk people when they say this, and this is why people are starting to turn toward Christianity in the way that they are, because underlying it, as Rudolf Steiner has brought his Christology, and as I'm coming to really coming into an intimate relationship with it, it is it is an understanding that little destructions are necessary for resurrections in creation, and that's a metamorphic process that holds creation and polarity with destruction, with a mediating factor, which is the spiritual Holy Spirit self that is engendering a healthy metamorphosis of those polarities into something needing into the inherent world, something immanent. And we're participating in immanency when we are engaged in spiritual participation, say. And we are in danger of destroying ourselves finally and for all. Like, so then we're talking about like what I don't know what that means. like does it mean that we extinct ourselves and then something new arises that is generated out of the spiritual world that is post-human, something like that? I don't know. I mean, it seems like that's what we're flirting with in a way, because it seems like that's a reality that we're projecting out unconsciously with our transhumanism, for example, right? That's like a McLuhan-esque picture of what it is to transcend what it is to be a human as we know it, something like that. And so this is why people are searching for something spiritual, because there's something real behind the scenes going on that's getting closer and closer and closer to manifestation within individual human beings or social structures or something like that. It's mysterious. I'm not saying anything certain. I'm really just searching about and casting about here in process with you, and I've loved the way this conversation has gone.
You triggered something in me, which this is unexpected, but because I think perhaps it's like the end of the world sort of like a discussion and that type of thing that we're talking about, which unfortunately it's like isn't such a crazy idea. It's like in the 60s with the Bay of Pigs and that type of thing, we were close to it, and the world sort of like held its breath for a few years, and or for a few months, and we are back. The world is back in a similar situation without any doubt. But there is something that Steiner wrote. I'm going to share it with in a second. It's from GA173 in a series of lectures called The Karma of Untruthfulness, which this is one of these, we all have like a few favorite sort of like bits that sort of like really sort of like stick with us. So like there's like 20 years later, you're sort of thinking, what did he mean by that? What did he mean by that? I'm going to read this and so like then give you a little reflection on where my current thinking is on it. So this is, I think this is the 6th lecture. I'll link to it in the show notes. But he says, mankind is now faced with having to solve certain quite specific problems. This applies above all to something I have already spoken about, which is connected with today's much admired technology, a consequence of natural science, which is also much admired by spiritual science. In the comparatively near future, this much admired modern technology will reach a final stage where it will, in a certain way, cancel itself out. In contrast, something will come into being, I have mentioned it in passing here, which will enable people to make use of the delicate vibrations of their etheric bodies as a driving force with which to run machines. And there's like a secondary quote I'd like to add, which is more of an image that he gives elsewhere, and I can't remember the exact source of that at the moment, but I think it might be in the same. It's like 173, and he gives this picture of Michael. It's like almost behind Ahriman's back. So like saying, you're allowed to play for a certain time, and then I'm going to take it all away. And this is, you might be able to feel how these two pictures that are being created here are linked. There is this idea, this amazing technology that we have. It's the picture he's creating is that, so like one day suddenly it's going to be whipped from under our feet. What he doesn't say is how that's going to happen. He doesn't say it's going to be a nuclear war. Well, he wouldn't have been able to say that, or at least according to like normal ways of thinking, because nuclear technology didn't even exist then. But that is one possibility. Another possibility is so like something dramatic happening with the sun, which makes all of our advanced technology, it's like null and void. Who knows what is going on there? But it's like this destruction cycle that it does feel like it's close. I'm not saying it's inevitable, far from that, but it feels distinctly possible. But it also, if I am, first of all, one, if Steiner is right, and two, if I'm interpreting him correctly, so like both two very big ifs, then this is a process of destruction that is also like going to be necessary so that we move forward in our evolution.
Yeah, I mean, I think any reasonable person can see how this technology would cancel itself out. I mean, we have a multi-crisis going on, and one of the, as Zach Stein so beautifully puts it, one of the parts of the fourfold crisis we have is a capacity crisis and teacherly authority crisis. So we're essentially raising people to consume the technologies without understanding how they work. So nobody's going to maintain them. There's a point at which, right,
yeah,
it's just all going to come to a grinding halt. I think I can see that scenario. Let's say I don't want to be predictive. I can see that scenario, and it, in a sense, it doesn't have to. Like, so yeah, maybe Michael is standing behind the Ahrimanic. What's the what is the popular term for what I would deem Ahrimanic is Moloch.
Odds.
Moloch, I think, is what
yeah.
Some folks have given some legitimacy to. It's what Steiner would refer to as Ahriman, and more. Ahriman's more than Moloch. But in any case, Michael standing behind Ahriman, waiting for us, right?
Yes.
To say, I really want to engage with the spiritual hierarchies, right? And they leave us in freedom. They're not going to intervene, right? So shit can go really bad, or it doesn't have to go that bad if we start to back up into our heritage as that which is part of an eternal becoming, something like that, and allow our souls to be receptive and vulnerable as strength, right? And allow this incarnative process to continue as we awaken to it, as opposed to this we're threatening ourselves with a devolutionary move, with a permanent cutting off from the spiritual. And then if that happens, then the destruction will be final, right? In whatever final means, because it's not going to be final for the spiritual world, say, but we are failing the spiritual if we allow that to happen. And I'm very optimistic, by the way. This seems like doom, we've turned to doom porn or something, but I'm very optimistic that the Jordan Halls and even the John Vervaekes, I know you and I have I don't say we disagree, but I'm more
different appreciations of
these folks who are really pushing toward the threshold, I would say. And it's not that John Vervaeke is going to be here, have a legacy, an intellectual legacy 50 years from now. But I think there's some people who are in our space who very well could. And John could too, if he could let go of some of the ways in which he's bound to the self-imposed limits of natural science, similar to the way Augustine was bound to his own self-limiting aspects.
He's a truly modern man.
Truly modern man.
There must be a song when I say it like that. Somebody must have done a song like that.
Well, I think of David Bowie in Modern Love, which is sort of in my interpretation of that song, and I guess it can be interpreted in many ways. Modern love is getting to church on time. That sort of thing. It's the sort of pedestrian and superficial, right? The religious life is essentially the religious life is just a superficial enactment, right?
I can't explain this, and but Talking Heads is saying there's something there, but I can't think of a song that's like captures it, but I think it's somewhere in Talking Heads. If anybody's still watching this video and they can think about which song I'm actually thinking about, then let me know.
Yeah I think of maybe Life in Wartime.
Well, we've reached the end of yet another life-changing book.
Yeah, we beat the hell out of that chapter, I can tell you what.
Yeah, so it's been a fantastic journey, hasn't it? It really has. I hope for those people that do get to like this far and actually see the end of it, and perhaps have been with us on this journey all the way through, they'll realize like what an amazing amount of ground has been covered, and to emphasize that we've actually really only scratched the surface, even though we've dedicated a lot of hours to it.
Yes, yeah, and it's all process, so forgive us for the things we have said.
Yeah. Some people have like been like less kind with their comments, like one slip up here and one slip up there, and it's like, but that's the nature of the game.
Generally quite positive, actually.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Good, well received. So, what we haven't decided what we're going to do next for a book, but we have some intervening ideas as relates to Spinoza and Spinoza's Christianity. Spinoza as Christian, which is largely ignored. In the what do you say? Spinoza is Christian in the sense that we're trying to promote in a certain way.
Exactly. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Shall I do the do that one?
Yes.
Indeed.